The title of this lecture is Qualia and the Mary Problem. The problem was framed some years ago by the philosopher Frank Jackson, and I shall take a passage from his published article on this very subject. He sets up the problem very well. So here's the way Frank Jackson begins it. Quote, "Mary is a brilliant scientist who is, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky and use terms like red, blue, and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina, and exactly how this produces, via the central nervous system, the contraction of the vocal cords, the expulsion of air from the lungs that results in the uttering of the sentence, 'The sky is blue.' It can hardly be denied that it is in principle possible to obtain all this physical information from black and white television. Otherwise, the Open University would of necessity need to use color television. What will happen when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Will she learn anything or not? It seems just obvious that she will learn something about the world and our visual experience of it. But then it is inescapable that her previous knowledge was incomplete. But she had all the physical information. Therefore, there is more to have than that, and physicalism is false." Close quote. So there you have the Mary problem set up by Frank Jackson. The problem presented here is that nasty one, at least from the perspective of the physicalist, the problem of qualia. Qualia is the plural form of the Latin quale and refers to qualities. More specifically, it refers to the qualities that enter into our experience of things. On this account, an object that is round and red will have these two qualities, and we would say that roundness and redness stand as qualia. What Frank Jackson was arguing for, a position, by the way, that he subsequently retreated from, is that if physicalism were adequate in all respects, then to know everything about the physics of the situation is to know everything. If in fact Mary knows everything about the physics of light, then presumably she knows everything about light. But if she knows everything about light, how is it that on entering the world of color for the first time, she now knows something that heretofore she didn't know? One might be tempted to reply that what Mary comes to know entering the world of color, she knows by way of experiences. It just happens that having been reared in black and white environments, she had no relevant experience, and therefore learned through experience that objects, which she always knew in some sense had color, give rise to experiences about which she previously had no knowledge. Well, yes, and this is precisely the point that Frank Jackson was making. There is a kind of knowledge delivered to us by way of our experiences which cannot be delivered to us in any other way. I should say that Jackson's article caused quite a stir. As recently as 2004, an entire book has been devoted to the Mary problem with the fetching title, "There's Something About Mary." I should pause, however, and note that this challenge is not a new one. I might call attention here to a work published in 1810 by the celebrated German genius Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose dates are 1749 to 1832. The title of the work in German was Zur Farbenlehre, generally translated as Theory of Color. What Goethe is at pains to establish in this lengthy work is that the Newtonian theory of light explains everything except what we actually see. Now, this is not the place to examine the strengths and weaknesses of Goethe's own theory, which I should say by contemporary standards is scarcely adequate and on some key points patently false. He does present a number of novel notions and even novel findings of a most interesting sort. For example, that color experiences can be produced by black and white objects presented in a certain way. But this is beside the point at issue. Here, at the very beginning of the 19th century, we find Goethe preparing the world for what will come to be called the Romantic Rebellion. To summarize this complex development all too briefly, I should say that it was a rebellion not against science, but against what's sometimes called scientism, against what had become something of the religion of science, arrogantly absorbing into itself the full panoply of human interests, desires, wisdom. It was clear to Goethe that science was in no position to make such claims, and that the aesthetic domain especially was immune to its methods and perspectives. Goethe, we would surmise, would see no problem in the Mary problem, for he had already made clear that no matter how complete our understanding of the physics of light might be, that understanding alone could neither predict nor explain the actual experiences we have by way of light and vision. Well, what are these qualia? Are they ever the same for two different persons? Do Jack and Jill see the same red? Do they hear the same melody? Is there really any method by which we could even begin to answer such questions? I should say there are approaches within experimental psychology that set out to settle matters of this kind. I can't say that they've settled the matter, but the approaches themselves are interesting and reasonable. We might take an example of the question of whether two persons see the same red and seeing what psychology does with it. Now, assuming that both persons know how to use color names, we might set up an experiment in which we present each of the subjects with lights that vary in wavelength and see the frequency with which they assign red to a given range of wavelengths. There may be conceptual reservations about the conclusion reached, but at least at a common-sense level, we might be willing to accept that both persons see the same red when they assign the term red over precisely the same range of wavelengths. It is obvious that this method tells us nothing about what might be called the inner experience of each. It's not an experiment designed to settle the question of just what qualia are experienced by two different persons. But as of now, this is about as good as an experimental approach as the question admits of. The approach is far more convincing than would be a comparison of the responses of the brains or the nerves of two different persons, for there's no reason to assume that identical physiological responses in two different persons will unfailingly yield identical experiences. If we want to know what people see, the best approach is to ask them. Nonetheless, there is a general tendency to regard the brain's record as somehow more valid or revealing than the mere utterances of actual persons with their eyes opened. Well, suppose we share this impatience with mere verbal reports and wish to look into the machinery of things in order to settle the question as to whether two persons experience the same qualia. This is the course of action that Daniel Dennett recommends for dealing with the Mary problem. As Dennett understands Mary's dilemma, she is either lacking in relevant knowledge or has not made the proper use of it. Let's assume, as Frank Jackson set up the problem, that Mary really does know everything. In that case, argues Dennett, she would have to know how the deep structures of the brain respond to information from the peripheral sense organs, such that these brain mechanisms give rise to qualia. But surely this won't work. To begin with, even as Mary knows everything, she certainly doesn't know how brain mechanisms give rise to qualia, for no one knows how brain mechanisms give rise to qualia. Let's say, however, that Mary's knowledge does include what we've learned over the past century about the relationship between color experience and the physiology of the nervous system. We suppose further that she has focused very sharply on what has been discovered regarding brain responses to color. Her knowledge will include information as to how scientists establish these relationships. She will have learned that the scientists had to consult actual persons and had to have confidence in statements they made about their actual experiences. Without the reported qualia by such persons, there would have been no basis upon which to make any sense at all out of whatever data the scientists had extracted from the brain. We must keep in mind that the brain is constantly active, the visual system responding incessantly to events that reach the retina. If this is going to provide the basis upon which to judge what Jack or Jill is seeing, it will never be enough to know only the activity going on in the nervous system. There will have to be some way of tying particular events in the nervous system to what? The qualia reported by Jack and Jill. That is to say, somewhere down the line, and not very far down the line. It will be the qualia that provide the relevant data if the events in the nervous system are to explain anything about experience at all. Accordingly, at least at this point, it will not be the brain sciences, or at least the brain sciences alone, that could possibly settle the Mary problem. Perhaps Frank Jackson missed a major point in setting up the problem. Now, he has Mary raised in a visually impoverished environment, at least with respect to color. As noted by the philosopher Paul Churchland, conditions such as this will prevent the normal development of those very mechanisms responsible for the processing of color information. Churchland is certainly on solid scientific grounds in arguing that the adult Mary will be seriously lacking in relevant neurophysiological functions. In light of these deficits, Mary cannot be said to know everything about the effect of light, for part of what goes into knowing everything will include brain processes which, arguably, she is lacking. Now, is this a decisive criticism of the conclusions Jackson initially drew from the Mary problem? Well, if there is a last word to be said on this, it surely will not come from me. I'm strongly inclined to think, however, that the Churchland rejoinder will not work any more successfully than does Daniel Dennett's. To say that early childhood visual deprivation will prevent Mary's visual system from developing normally is correct as far as it goes. But Jackson's initial thesis is predicated on the assumption that Mary's visual system is normal. At first blush, this suggests that Jackson was just missing a significant piece of scientific information. Churchland's rejoinder includes the fact that relevant experiences are necessary for us to learn about color in any way at all. We learned to call something blue by associating that word with experiences brought about by light of relatively short wavelength. Absent the relevant experiences, such a word has nothing to tie itself to. Now again, this is fine as far as it goes, but let us modify the Mary problem this way. We stipulate a person whose visual system is entirely normal, and whose environmental history has been rich and complete in all relevant respects. We shall refer to our subject now as Mary 2. We now present Mary 2 with a nicely wrapped package, a cube, 1 foot on each side. Now there are two facts that enter into Mary's complete knowledge of what soon will be seen to be relevant. The first fact is that some persons have an allergic reaction to ivy of a certain kind. We call it poison ivy. The second fact is that Mary, too, is one of those persons. But at no time in the past has Mary, too, been exposed to poison ivy. She does know, however, that those who are allergic to it develop a rash and an itch that may take days to clear up. We decide to be a bit nasty here in order to complete the experiment. So we blindfold Mary, too, and ask her to reach into the box and take out a present. Oh, and by the way, there is a nice present in there also. But there's a bit of poison ivy as well, just a slight amount. The predicted fact comes about. Mary, too, develops a slight rash, which she proceeds to scratch, soon to find some relief from a bit of cortisone topically applied. Now, is it not clear that although Mary, too, knew everything there was to know about the relevant allergy, about the fact that she suffered from that allergy, and the fact that the allergic response would include a rash and itchiness, that nonetheless the actual itchiness presented her with something she could not have claimed to know before the fact? So Paul Churchland's rejoinder, though more refined and interesting than Daniel Dennett's, stands on the same ground. Both of them do really seem to ignore the central point. The description of an experience is different from the experience itself. Alas, there may be another rejoinder available to the physicalist, such that Jackson's Mary problem is seen to be specious. Specious in the sense that it fails to distinguish between knowing that and knowing how. Mary knows everything about the physics of light, and that means that she knows everything that there is to know about the physics of light. I may read a book describing everything that has to be known by one who would ride a unicycle. The book might contain whole chapters on the special difficulty of maintaining one's balance on a unicycle. Presumably, I could then give lectures on the subject. But no matter how great my proficiency in knowing about these things, I still do not know how to ride a unicycle. Considered in this light, Mary's problem is actually the problem of not knowing how to assign color names, or how to do things with color, or generally how to match her behavior properly to phenomena involving color. But does this distinction between knowing how and knowing that actually get to the heart of the issue? We all know what it is like to have experiences of a given kind. And we all know the difference between having experiences of a given kind and in some sense knowing what experiences of a given kind include at the level of fact or data. When Mary enters the world of color, quite apart from the question of whether she knows how to deal with it, it is apparent that she will have an experience that was unforeseen by her during the years in which she developed a thorough knowledge of the physics of light. Well, call me stubborn, but I do not believe that the knowing how distinction matters very much here at all. Let's get back to the nervous system. Given its complexity and the richness of its interconnections, it is tempting simply to believe that all that hardware is surely able to bring about qualia. The problem of qualia, however, is related to, but different from, questions about factors that seem to be necessary for their occurrence. Consider a thought experiment proposed several decades ago by Ned Block. This is odd, and wonderfully so. It's often referred to as the Chinese nation experiment, China chosen here because of its very large population. In Ned Block's experiment, each citizen of China, stay with this now, each citizen of China is equipped to function as an individual neuron. Each has access to a telephone, has a list of numbers to call, and in general is able to enter into a complex network of information transmitting fellow citizens. Ned Block sets up the pattern of phone calls so that in time it mimics perfectly the signals generated in an individual's nervous system and associated with what? With the sensation of pain. Now, on the standard account, what the Chinese nation has achieved through the actions of its entire population is nothing short of pain, though no citizen of China at the time is actually in pain. The point Ned Block was attempting to drive home in this very graphic example is that qualia such as pain are not successfully explained merely by reference to functional states, no matter how complex. The Chinese nation might mimic all the functional states taking place in the nervous system of one who is in pain, but the states thus brought about do not yield pain qualia. One is reminded here of a much older thought experiment propounded by Gottfried Leibniz toward the end of the 17th century. It appears in a treatise he titled Monadology, which was published in 1688, where he considers the unique nature of perceptual experience. Here's Leibniz on the subject, quote, "It must be confessed that perception, and that which depends on it, are inexplicable on mechanical grounds, that is to say, by means of figures and motions. And supposing there were a machine so constructed as to think, feel, and have perception, it might be conceived as increased in size while keeping the same proportions, so that one might go into it as into a mill. That being so, we should, on examining its interior, find only parts which work upon one another, and never anything by which to explain a perception." Close quote. We can enter the mill envisaged by Leibniz, or we can watch the entire population of China making phone calls, and in neither case will qualia be explicated. Conscious experience seems to be one of those problems that just won't go away. At the same time, conscious experience seems to ground nothing less than our defining and essential nature. On this point, I turn to an even more famous article in philosophy than Frank Jackson's. In 1974, the philosopher Thomas Nagel published an article with the intriguing title, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question here is not related to what it's like to be able to hang upside down from a tree, or to be featured in Dracula movies, or to nest in attics. Instead, the question gets at what it's like to be an entity that has experiences of a certain kind. Nagel puts it this way, quote, "The fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something it is like to be that organism. There may be further implications about the form of the experience. There may even, though I doubt it, be implications about the behavior of the organism. But fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is to be that organism, something it is like for the organism." Close quote. The criterion of consciousness here is not merely being awake, it's having experiences. In some sense, no matter how primitive, it is to be aware, to know of other events external to oneself or arising within oneself. Now, if we combine the Mary problem in Frank Jackson's essay and the criteria set forth in Thomas Nagel's essay, we can say that once Mary enters the world of color, she is now different. What it is like to be Mary A is different from what it is like to be Mary B. Experiences have a transforming effect, different from the effects of knowledge as such. As I've indicated in previous lectures, the problem of consciousness, of which the Mary problem is a particularly vivid example, comes to be a problem because of certain core assumptions that we are strongly inclined to make. I refer, of course, to the core assumptions of physicalism. We all respect, we are all the beneficiaries of achievements in science, many of which depend directly on a perspective that just is the physicalistic perspective. We treat ourselves to measured pride in the fact that we are not burdened by the antique superstitions of earlier ages. We treat ourselves to measured pride that we take facts where we find them and don't look for ghostly or wraith-like entities behind these facts. We might shy away from the confident assertion that, in principle, physics is complete, but we feel increasingly at home with the modest assertion that problems at the level of fact are to be settled scientifically, if they can be settled at all. Well, if there's anything at the level of fact, consciousness must be it, for it seems to be that one fact in which all other facts are located. And in this we might find a key, if not a solution, at least to a fuller understanding of the problem itself. It is indeed consciousness that is the framework within which all other facts are located. For us as knowing subjects, there is no factual domain external to this framework. I hesitate to press on with this point for fear of seeming to be a guru. I'm tempted to employ the overworked analogy of fish in water. Of all the things a fish might discover, water is surely not one of them. Well, we are, as it were, immersed in consciousness in just the sense in which fish are immersed in water. Carrying the analogy a little bit further, we might be willing to grant that fish could learn how to speak about water. They might even engage in philosophical disputes regarding the problem of water. Like Mary, they might even learn everything there is to know about water. I wonder, however, if, even under such conditions, they would know what water is really. Would they know it is wet? We think we have a special advantage here in that every night we lose consciousness. There are other occasions, such as the period just before sleep, when consciousness is greatly weakened. And then, too, there are conditions such as those associated with illness or trauma, where consciousness becomes temporarily eliminated. Now, to the extent that one recovers from all of these conditions and is restored to full consciousness, one actually is more like a fish that can live in and out of water and make the relevant comparisons. The analogy here suggests that fish may have the ability to discover water only when removed from it. We can discover the nature of consciousness owing to the fact that we lose it daily. Well, perhaps. I must not become tiresome with appeals to the mystery of it all. I say only that I know what it is like to go to sleep and then to awaken. I have the experience several hundred times each year. Excluding naps, but including my infancy, I would say this is an experience I've had perhaps 20,000 times. Speaking personally, I'd have to admit to being a very slow learner, for my understanding of consciousness has not been significantly expanded or deepened as a function of the number of such experiences. So too with all of the reliably recurring qualia with which experiential life is filled. Each qualia might finally be translated into some number of impulses in some neuron somewhere in the brain. One might even learn, reluctantly or otherwise, to abandon the language of qualia and adopt that of neurophysiology. But at the end of the day, a rose by any other name will smell as sweet. And even as we attempt to translate the language of qualia into the language of physics, the very heart of the qualia themselves is left outside. More to come.